Coming up, erratic weather in parts of the global south is hitting production of the planet's most popular morning beverage hard.
Hạn hán thì nói chung là khô cạn hết.
Coffee plantations are sprouting fewer beans, and rising temperatures are making it easier for pests and diseases.
And sometimes when we have prolonged droughts, trees dry up, and this brings a big loss to the smallholder farmers.
We look into what's developing into a crisis for some, and the efforts to ensure that as the price of coffee beans rises, the small farmers the industry relies on get their fair share.
I would assume automatic because coffee is such, again, a loved drink. If the price rises, then this benefits everybody in the supply chain, I guess, from farmers to retailers. But you're saying that that's not correct.
That's a really good point and a really good question and a very valid thing to think. But
Just 2 degrees is on. Now,
Does that mean that you stopped buying coffee?
I personally haven't stopped buying coffee.
Oh, I love Turkish coffee. It's aromatic, flavorful, and it's prepared in a unique way that differentiates it from other brews. And the presentation is such an integral part of Turkish coffee culture. But climate change is having impacts on the way we develop and produce coffee, Sarah. In essence, coffee might be in trouble.
Yeah, a coffee crisis is definitely brewing. I mean, the world's top producers are being slammed by natural disasters.
Year after year, increasingly unpredictable weather, severe floods and droughts threaten to decimate crops in Brazil, while intense typhoons and water scarcity cause shortfalls in Vietnam.
Hạn hán thì nói chung là khô cạn hết những cái vùng miền ấy, xung quanh và cùng ở lân cận thì thiếu nước gọi là quá trầm trọng. Nên là cái tỷ lệ mà so với năm này để mà cho thu hoạch được trái cà phê ấy, thì gọi là rất ít, mất rất nhiều, nói chung là sạch.
Experts point to climate change, saying it's driving up the price of production, leading to a costlier cup.
Aqui nós tivemos 50 propriedades atingidas, tudo pequeno produtor. A minha ainda, mas tem produtor aí que eu estava ajudando a apagar o fogo, falei, não, daqui uns anos isso aqui não tem condição. É pedra, ladeira e a família está lá, está lutando. Nós fomos para frente aí, foram 50 propriedades, nesses quase 600 hectares queimados.
The International Coffee Organization reports a nearly 20% surge in coffee export prices, which brings up what you'll pay for that cup.
The price of a cup of coffee in Istanbul has shot up more than 130% in the last year. New York has seen it go up from 5 to more than 6 or 7. And a cup in Canada has gone up more than 20%.
Other factors make coffee more expensive: rampant speculation by traders and rising energy and labor prices. But climate change is the biggest threat in the long run, as rising temperatures risk cutting areas good for growing in half by 2050. Colombia, Indonesia, Honduras, Ethiopia, and Peru are all on the list of countries most vulnerable. Brazilian farmers, makers of the most beans worldwide, are reeling from wildfires.
Tudo isso significa o quê? Uma safra de café que pode vir a ser menor. Como o mercado acaba antecipando esses movimentos, já temos visto a cotação do café arábica em Nova York, robusta na Europa, operando em patamares mais elevados.
It's an industry that supports 120 million livelihoods. But unabated warming and market instability could mean a bitter brew.
some of the best coffee beans are produced in the global south: El Salvador, Brazil, Ethiopia, where many farmers, as we mentioned earlier, don't earn enough to cover their own costs. But one organization in the UK is helping to provide stable incomes despite the industry's inconsistencies. But before we get to that, I spoke with one agronomist with 10 years experience with coffee farmers in Uganda. I'm really glad that you can join us here on the program because I'm really curious to hear about the perspectives of farmers in the global south. How is climate change affecting coffee produce?
The effect of climate change is huge to coffee farmers, given the fact that majority of the coffee farmers in the global south are smallholder farmers, and they are highly vulnerable to these effects. The prolonged drought and erratic rains, short periods of the rain seasons that we are observing these days affect them enormously. You see that the yields are reducing at farm level because of pests and diseases, interruptions in the flowering, and sometimes when we have prolonged droughts, trees dry up, and this brings a big loss to the smallholder farmers.
We're seeing throughout the tropical coffee belt farmers being impacted by climate change, increasing temperatures, but also more erratic rainfall and increased drought.
Năm nay nói là hạn hán thì chị vẫn tưới đầy đủ, nhưng mà dẹp thì so với các lô khác thì không, chứ lô này của chị thì nói chung là năm nay nó cái dẹp nó mọi năm là cái dẹp đen, nhưng mà năm nay bùng phát cái con dẹp trắng.
Also, the pressure that these smallholder farmers are getting is high economically, because to mitigate these effects, they have to invest a lot to put irrigation systems on their farms, to employ more labor, to carry out activities like digging trenches. So these are all very expensive. And funny enough, the market has not yet recognized these labor requirements to add a premium for farmers who are fighting to mitigate climate change.
Now with the climate change, we have unpredictable rainy patterns, whereby in terms of crop production, we are not able to predict when to apply the fertilizers or farming inputs in general. And that one, it affects coffee production, where I would have expected a coffee plant to give you like 10 kgs. Without applying the fertilizers, you end up getting like 2 kgs, which translates into raw production and the raw income to a farmer.
Can farmers afford to continue producing coffee in Uganda? I'm trying to get a sense of what does it cost for them to produce versus how much they earn.
You see, recently the prices were down. Currently, the prices have tried to raise, but you will see that a kilo of coffee at farm level right now at FAQ is around 12,000 Uganda shillings, and a farmer invests around 8,000. You have all the costs involved to produce this coffee. But if you compare a smallholder farmer who does not have a big piece of land, it's not that much in the labor they are putting in. On a larger scale, makes some sense, but at small scale, it's not yet where it should be.
What are the biggest climate challenges for Uganda that result in reduced coffee yields? I think you mentioned drought. Is that the main challenge there?
Yeah, if you are to scale the challenges, drought is number one, and we have heavy rains that come with heavy winds and they break coffee trees. But the high levels of rain come along with pests and diseases. We have seen a disease called uh, the coffee red blister disease increasing its severity in the Robusta areas. And also the Arabicas, the coffee berry disease is also very high because of these heavy rains.
In Kenya, we produce Arabica coffee, which prefers cool and wet conditions. Because of increase of temperature caused by climate change and depressed rains, then we have poorer quality of the yields and poorer amounts of the yields.
So when you add on the post-harvest challenges that come about with the increased rains, the effect becomes really much. But also, when we do not have enough time to dry the coffee, then the quality is affected. So you'll have a lot of black beans and quality problems, which then affects the value of the coffee.
Before I let you go, Hussein, we know international retailers of coffee have mechanisms in place that protect their profits. Do coffee farmers in Uganda have similar mechanisms? Are there mechanisms put in place by the government that protect the coffee farmers?
Not much, especially when I consider Uganda's situation. The market is very liberal. Of course, we have UCDA, Uganda Coffee Development Authority, as the regulating authority, but the responsibility remains that of the farmer and the different coffee value chain actors. Of course, the government at policy level would provide an enabling environment. For example, subsidizing on the irrigation schemes for farmers to adopt, but it's not that felt by the farmers. The farmers still handle these issues themselves, and those who can adapt and can reinvest from the income they get from their coffee revenues, then they mitigate and they can sustain reasonable production. But those who cannot, then they really have serious effects.
Thanks, Hussein. It was good speaking with you. So it looks like troubling times ahead for coffee as rising temperatures, longer summers, lots of rain, unpredictable rain, and drought affect production.
The imbalance of high demand and short supply is sure to mean that higher costs could become the new normal. But if the price of your coffee or beans keeps rising, would you continue buying it? I spoke with Max Milward of the Fairtrade Foundation about what prices could look like in the future and who's affected the most.
I am really curious about coffee. I'm not a huge coffee drinker. I'm not too sure if you are, but does the rising price of coffee affect demand at all because it's such a loved drink?
Yes, absolutely. It's a very good question. I am a big coffee drinker, and I think it's been reported that the price of coffee on our supermarket shelves has gone up by an enormous 15%, which is quite eye-watering, and some have warned that the price of coffee, at least in UK coffee shops where I am, could soon reach an eye-watering £5 for our morning cup of coffee, which is a lot of money. So yes, is likely to impact consumers on the ground every day.
Just to wrap my head around this, does that mean that you stopped buying coffee and people in the UK, for example, are buying coffee less?
Well, I think it really depends. I personally haven't stopped buying coffee, but I think consumers will be thinking about the kinds of coffee that they buy. There are all sorts of different grades of coffee that you can buy and price points, particularly with Fairtrade. You can buy premium coffee, you can buy less premium quality coffee in the supermarket. So I think consumers will really be thinking about that.
Interesting, because I would assume automatically, because coffee is such, again, a loved drink, if the price rises, then this benefits everybody in the supply chain, I guess, from farmers to retailers.
That's a really good point and a really good question and a very valid thing to think. But what we do see is that, yes, sudden coffee price rises might look good for the producer on the surface. Temporarily high coffee prices might seem like a good thing, but actually the reality is very different. So sudden price rises, particularly after a coffee cooperative has fixed its contracts with its buyers, sudden price rises can cause a huge strain on coffee cooperatives. What we really see in reality is a very volatile coffee market that goes from extreme highs to extreme lows. And that's something that's very difficult for coffee farmers to navigate. But despite it being such a lucrative industry, coffee farmers really don't enjoy the standard of living that their hard work deserves. Very few coffee farmers earn a living income. And we at the Fairtrade Foundation think that that's fundamentally unfair. If you've got prices that continue to fluctuate from extreme highs to extreme lows, then that just means really unpredictable situations for coffee farmers to navigate. And it's very hard for them to plan sustainably for the long term and to make investments for the future. We know that these price rises are the result of unseasonal weather events happening at key origins. We also know that climate change is bringing more pests, faster spreading diseases, which makes the reality of growing coffee at origin incredibly difficult.
And it's also bringing a lot of drought as well, drought conditions, for example, in Brazil, which is one of the biggest coffee producers on the planet. They've been seeing a drought for the past year and a half. Talk about what coffee the coffee plant needs to thrive and how climate change impacts that process.
Yes. Well, the coffee plant needs predictable weather to thrive. And what we're really seeing at the moment is unpredictable weather. So there's coffee growing in Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, there's coffee growing in East Africa, and there's coffee growing in Latin America. So there are lots of different environments, but it needs to be consistent. The climate needs to be consistent. And if we take a look at East Africa, for example, I was speaking to a coffee farmer last week from Uganda called Jennifer, who runs a coffee cooperative. And she is seeing that coffee growing is becoming more and more difficult with changing climate, and coffee farmers within her cooperative are having to move higher and higher up the mountain that they farm on every year to try and reach cooler climates to avoid the threats of pests and diseases. And the worrying thing that Jennifer said to me was that within 10 years, they fear that there will no longer be anywhere to grow the coffee. And that's the situation in East Africa, but you also mentioned Brazil, which is experiencing prolonged periods of dry weather. The Minas Gerais region, which produces nearly a third of Brazil's Arabica coffee, has had very little rainfall in recent weeks, and the weather forecast predicts prolonged periods of drier than normal conditions. So there are fears of bad harvests and thus coffee shortages, which has this impact on coffee prices. But
I saw one report, Max, that said coffee prices might rise by another 25% over the next year. Is it time that we start thinking of alternatives to drink?
Well, I don't think alternatives are really an option when we know how much people rely on their coffee every day to stay awake and to keep functioning, but also when we have such a interconnected global system. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who rely on coffee every day for their livelihoods. If people can choose fair trade, then we can do our bit to protect the future of fair trade coffee. We know
that... If you could
that...
briefly tell us exactly how fair trade does help smallholder farms.
Absolutely, yes. So Fairtrade ensures that coffee farmers receive fair prices for their beans so they can afford to farm sustainably, build a better quality of life, to build resilience to climate events and price shocks. It means that they can afford to put food on the table for their families and get a good education for their children. Obviously, Fairtrade can't do this single-handedly, but what it can offer is it can offer some inbuilt resilience for farmers. So Fairtrade has a unique minimum price and an additional Fairtrade premium, which farmers receive through their sales on Fairtrade terms. And it means that they've got more working capital and more control over how these funds are invested.
Worst case scenario, Max, and prices do rise by 25% in 2025. Are you going to pay this amount for your cup of coffee?
I think I personally always will do, because I need a cup of coffee to get through the day. And also I know how, having met farmers, having been to Vietnam and met farmers there, and having met farmers from Uganda, I know how important it is that we continue to pay a fair amount for that coffee. And when prices rise for us in shops, it's also the case that the cost of production will be rising for those coffee farmers. So the coffee farmers aren't just receiving more money for their crop, they're also paying more for labor, they're paying more for inputs like fertilizers. So the cost of living for us is mirrored in the cost of production for farmers as well. So I think it's always fair to continue to buy these crops that we have always needed and continue to need from farmers around the world. So yes, I will certainly be continuing to buy my coffee.
And that's our show on coffee. I hope you enjoyed this or learned something from it. Before I leave you, there's a tradition with Turkish coffee that is very interesting. It's a tradition that people use here to tell the future or the current state of their life. So how it works is that you finish your coffee, you take the saucer of your coffee, you flip the coffee, wait for it to cool, which can take minutes, 10 minutes. And once you see that it's cool, you look inside and the coffee bean formation is somehow supposed to help you tell the future.